like I said, very fascinating projects.
Welcome to this Wuxia, Xianxia and Asian Fantasy panel. My name is Xueting. I'm super excited to be here with all our fantastic guests. So we'll start with some introductions. My name is Xueting, and I'm a Chinese culture writer and translator. At the moment, I'm working on an anthology of contemporary horror fiction and a non-fiction book on the pop culture of Wuxia. And so I'll go around the screen. Wesley?
Hi, I'm Wesley Chu. I'm primarily a science fiction author. I'm the author of 13 books now, and my fantasy debut, which I hate saying the word debut, but my first fantasy book, I should say, just came out in August, called The Art of Prophecy. It's a Wuxia-inspired secondary world epic fantasy that is kind of like my love letter to the Wuxia genre.
And Nghi?
Hi, I'm Nghi Vo. I'm a science fiction and fantasy writer. I've written a couple books. I've written more short stories. I live in the upper Midwest, and I think I'm probably best known for The Empress of Salt and Fortune, which is the first book in the Singing Hill cycle, which tackles fantasy China and whatever special interest I've been messing around with lately. The nice thing about the whole series, there's a new one coming out at the end of the year, and they're short, so they're only about 100 pages, so you can decide pretty quickly if you're in or out.
So smart. Don't write big books.
No,
friends don't let friends write big books.
Actually, there is something about the novella that you can pretty much read it in one sitting, and I read the first one. It's absolutely amazing, and I look forward to reading more.
It's stunning.
Oh,
very nice.
Wesley's book as well, if I have a chance to. I think it's not out yet. The Art of Prophecy, is it come out? Has it?
It's out in the US, and it's scheduled to come out in, I believe, April in the UK.
Oh yeah, really looking forward to that. And Tao, would you introduce yourself?
My name's Tao Wong. I'm a science fiction and fantasy author, mostly focused on lit RPG and Xianxia works. Specifically, especially for this panel, I write the 1,000 Li series, which is based upon a secondary world, Xianxia.
Secondary world, that's fascinating. I love how in these genres of Wuxia and Xianxia, you have kind of one narrative and then it's kind of mingled with a secondary narrative, which makes it kind of like a labyrinthine experience, reading experience. Amélie?
Yes, thanks. That's correct. Hello, my name is Amélie Wen Zhao. I'm the author of Song of Silver Flame Like Night, which is a Chinese Xianxia-inspired fantasy about a colonized kingdom and the two teens who must liberate it by waking the demons that sleep at its heart. I'm originally from Beijing, so very excited to be here and chatting with my fellow Asian diaspora authors.
So looking forward to reading that book. Were you born in Paris? I read.
Born in Paris because of some strange historical reason where my parents went overseas after the opening and reform of China, and then went back to Beijing as a very young kid and grew up there.
That's a really interesting experience because usually people go the other way. I've lived in Beijing for a year or so studying. I really love the city.
Oh.
And last but not least, Alice.
Hi. Hello, I'm Alice Poon, and I'm a Hong Kong native now residing in Richmond, BC. Since childhood, I have been a great fan of Jin Yong's wuxia novels. And I have published 2 historical novels, The Green Phoenix and Tales of Ming Courtesans. The Heavenly Sword is my debut wuxia myth fantasy work, which has just been released. And it's the first part of a duology. Here it is. Writing a wuxia story feels like returning to my home turf. That's it.
That's lovely, and I can see that in the writing, definitely. I'm reading that at the moment. Okay, so we'll kick off with some questions for everyone. So first of all, I thought it would be useful for the audience if we explore the concept of wuxia xianxia or xia. What is xia fiction? It's been compared to many things as it made its way into the outside of China and to the Anglophone world. Most of all, things like Lord of the Rings, which I can't help but feel isn't, although I can see the similarities, isn't maybe entirely appropriate. But xia fiction is essentially about vigilantism and these acts of justice outside the bounds of law for the greater good. So I'd like to invite all our guests to talk a little bit about what xia means to you, wuxia fiction or xianxia fiction. And I'll start with Amélie on this one.
With me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I thought about this question, and it's interesting because I realized that there's no, direct translation for xia. It's, most people call it like legendary hero or warrior or vigilante, but it's kind of all those aspects combined. And I think it exists in a very uniquely cultural context of, China and Greater China, and how it arose in history with wuxia and xianxia fiction is that I think it arose more so from the people. I know there were definitely some eras where, the imperial court was not too fond of the rebels and vigilantes that operated outside of the existing systems of law that they had put in place back then. So some of it was restricted historically. And it's interesting to see that, it rose from the people and it's still being written by the people. A lot of the very popular Chinese xianxia and wuxia stories right now are being written as web novels, accessible to, I guess, everybody online. So it's been such an interesting evolution of the genres. And I do think that in a very simplistic comparison, I can understand why people are saying, xianxia is kind of like the high fantasy genre of China with all the mythology and folklore and religion. And then wuxia, I've heard someone compare it to like Westerns in the US, and I understand where it's coming from. But again, I think it just exists in a very uniquely cultural context.
It certainly does. It's a very unique cultural phenomenon. Although you mentioned Westerns and wuxia films in the mid 20th century were certainly influenced by films like American action films and Westerns. And what you say was really interesting about the interplay between the xia, the swordsmen, their actions, and the state. And this kind of fiction tends to be more present when during times of kind of unrest and kind of dynastic changes. And there's always throughout history, in the history of wuxia and xianxia, the swordsmen have played various roles. Sometimes they're more kind of free roaming kind of swordsmen, and other times they kind of work with the state, and other times they sort of fill in for what the government is not doing. So there's always this kind of tension and interplay between the genre and the state. So can I have Nghi's input?
I really, really liked what you had to say about the fact that as genres, they're unique. And on one hand, it's hard to compare them to something like a Western. On the other hand, I will say that ever since I started thinking about it, years and years now, one of the places of similarity that I've always seen a lot of comparison to, and a lot of comparisons can be made, is to the Arthurian mythos and to the Russian tales of the Bogatyr. There's this idea of people answerable only to their own authority, which is both the appeal and the danger of these stories to me. They're people on the fringes. There are people who do not have a ready-made law to refer to, or to easily refer to, or that will defend them. So there is this sort of, there's a code of conduct there that is occasionally very much at odds with the world around them. And I think that's one of the big appeals of the genre to me, which is not exactly vigilantism, but people who are so set on their own path that they sort of deform the world around them.
I really love that expression, kind of people are so set on their own path, they deform the world around them. Because a lot of kind of certainly the Wuxia fiction of Jin Yong and his peers, but very much about history, about kind of, folklore and a lot of Chinese culture, but also about what it's like to be an individual, which he explores in this in the space of Wuxia fiction. So can I move on to Wesley?
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, first of all, I would say that my experience and concept of wuxia is very specific. Part of it's because I watched a lot of wuxia set that were made in a certain time period, and then like after a certain time, I stopped watching it because I was doing other stuff. So what my memories of wuxia is, really from the movies and from like films made between like the 60s and the 90s. So I mean, I think Amélie is absolutely correct that a comparison to what something a Western genre would be, the Western, the cowboy stories, and thing is, it's the setup for wuxia and for like a Western is similar, but the difference isn't in the setup; it's in the flavor and the tone and the emphasis of what wuxia looks at versus what a Western would focus on. I mean, if you think about it, like the concept of wuxia and like the jianghu, which is the translation for like rivers and lakes and forests. What they're saying is that what a jianghu is in the wuxia genre is it's a community of outsiders, the people who don't live in the city. There's people who live in the city, the nobles, the law and order, the magistrates, versus the people who live in the jianghu, the outsiders, the fringe. They're the Katniss Everdeen's. They're the people who are rugged and they have their own sense of honor and they live life their own way. They do things of themselves. So that is that idea is fairly common. I mean, we had the Robin Hoods back in the European literature. So, but the difference, what makes wuxia unique, is the flavor and the emphasis and what really and also the martial arts. I got into wuxia because I trained a lot of martial arts. I studied wushu for a long time, and part of the reason why I stopped watching it was because after I retired, at one point, like when you get punched in the head when you're young, you're like, oh, that's a good punch. But then when you get punched in the head when you're like 30, you're like, that's a concussion. So for me, I know you, Tal, you're like, I know what that feels like. But for me, it's like it was very difficult for me to retire because when it's such a big part of your life, once I retired, I actually stopped watching everything because everything reminded me of this very important part of my life when I was training quite a bit. But I'm sorry, I totally went on a left turn there. But yes,
I'd be interesting to know, Wesley, how your kind of practicing martial arts influences on your writing of, because a lot of Wuxia Xianxia is the kind of portrayal of the art of violence, as it were, the kung fu, the martial arts. but perhaps for another for another panel, another day. So yeah, so in that sense, as you were saying, Katniss Everdeen's of the world, that so the swordsmen are kind of perhaps a lot like the superheroes of the Western comics, in that they they are outsiders. They act outside the bounds of civilian society, and they have their very kind of their own codes, and but they do interact with. They're part of Jianghu, but they do interact with civilian society, and kind of whether it is to, you know, meter out justice or carry out vendettas or in various ways. So can I move on to Alice, please?
Hi. Okay. The term wuxia is made up of two Chinese words. The first word wu in the context of wuxia means martial arts. And the second word xia essentially means a vigilante or knight errant with Chinese characteristics who has a great sense of honor and righteousness. When the two words are put together, the term generally means martial arts heroes. As regards wuxia as a fiction genre, I'd just like to share what Jin Yong said about the genre. He pointed out that wuxia fiction has three definitive hallmarks, and they are: one, it has ancient historical settings; two, the main characters are martial artists with superior skills; three, the plot is largely about violent conflicts. He also said that wuxia fiction usually shares themes like knight-errant righteousness, brotherhood loyalty, resistance to tyrannical regimes, chivalric benevolence, and altruistic ideals. He actually said all these in the preface to the newest editions of his collection of works, and he wrote the preface in 2002. I think it can be said that the single word xia embodies all those themes or values, if you will. In other words, xia is the ultimate ideal of heroism. As for Xianxia, the Xianxia genre, my understanding is that it is similar to wuxia, but with a focus on Taoist cultivation aimed at reaching immortality, with elements of sorcery, ghosts, and spirits. Also, as far as I know, Xianxia fiction writers have been greatly influenced by wuxia fiction writers like Jin Yong and his contemporaries.
Thank you, Alice, for that very succinct definition. I think Jin Yong is definitely the writer, and his peers like Liang Yusheng and Gulong have definitely kind of defined the genre and made it very much about sense of honor and righteousness and justice and heroes, because it hasn't always been. Sometimes it started off with kind of these warriors who are kind of just extraordinary in their martial arts skills, and sometimes there have been people, sometimes the characters are, you know, more kind of focused on seeking revenge, and others are, I mean, and you mentioned the historical background to wuxia, and that's something that Jin Yong has done really well in kind of having that secondary narrative and bringing that, kind of mingling that with the what's the goings on in Jianghu, and furthermore, all these characters, some of them are heroes. For example, like Guo Jing, for example, is definitely a hero, and then we have lots of other characters who are motivated by wanting to become the most powerful swordsman in Jianghu or in the world, or wanting to protect somebody related to that, you know, who are connected to them, or and then they all come together and they kind of, in this kind of complex world, and which is partly what makes that period, the fiction from that period, so appealing, and it definitely set the benchmark for everything to come afterwards. And I don't think any other writer has set up such a complex world as Jin Yong and his contemporaries have.
That's right.
Oh, and Tao, can I have your input, please? Sorry, that's a long.
No worries. I was going to say, everyone's covered a lot of the things that I was going to say. When I try to explain wuxia to people, I often use things like the Western genre because it has a very distinct feel to it, right? And you know, the knight errants from Arthurian fiction and the stuff like that is so much easier to explain to people using those as references. But you know, Amelie's very right in that it's very specific to, I think, Chinese culture, really, and so it's not an exact thing. The one thing I was going to mention that really attracts me to wuxia fiction has always been the push and pull of the various aspects of, you know, between loyalty and duty, you know, between honor and, you know, love, you know, and you see all of these things kind of play out in the way that the heroes have to interact with each other, with the world around them, you know, between, you know, taking care with your sense of honor at the same time, and sometimes in conflict with the governments or with, you know, other individuals, and how that all ends up. And I think I don't see that to the same extent with, you know, Westerns or whatever. So that's the part that I really enjoy when I read wuxia or I watched wuxia or Xianxia works. And that's the type of things that I try to play with in my own writing.
Thank you. I think that's a really nice summary of the question. It's definitely, without doubt, a very unique kind of cultural product of Chinese and diaspora kind of diaspora culture, but it's very relatable to people around the world. So the next question I wanted to explore is, I think we touched a little bit on this. What are your early experiences of wuxia and xianxia stories? How did you first relate to the genre? As we're all diaspora writers, what is the diaspora experience of xia fiction? I'd like to start with Nghi, if I may. Tell us about those bootleg cassette.
Okay, something we talked about when we were setting up this panel. And okay, so my first experience with this genre as a whole was being a little kid, and you know, we were refugee families, so we were living in Illinois, and about every month we take a trip up to Chicago, where my parents would get, like, you know, a month's worth of groceries and gossip and hang out time with people who looked more like us.
Where in Illinois?
I lived in Peoria, actually, central Illinois, about 3 hours south of Chicago.
Naperville.
Oh, hey, rich boy. Sorry.
Sorry, keep going.
No,
Sorry.
No, it's I went to your high schools for speech tournaments. You guys had nice high schools.
I was on the speech team for a year.
Oh shit! What? No, never mind. That is not important right now. So there was this corner store, and there were these huge racks of bootleg DVDs that were all hand labeled, and you know, every month my parents would grab like a stack about, you know, 2 feet high, and we'd haul it back to Peoria with us. And about half those stacks were Paris by Night variety show tapings, and the other half, for my grandpa who lived with us half the time, were martial arts dramas, you know, and that's where my first memories came from, is sitting with my grandpa watching these things that my grandpa is I'm half Chinese, my grandpa's Chinese, I speak Vietnamese, so I'm just like this little kid sitting with him trying to figure out what's happening. And I remember like sort of patting him on the leg and saying, which one is that? Who's that? And he kind of says to me, just, he's looking and he's like, it's the good one. And I'm like, okay, that's as far as I need to know who is on the screen at any point. And I mean, furthering the Western connection, we ran out of tapes pretty quickly because he would just watch tons and tons of those. And then it's like we would move on to the Westerns and he's like, almost as good. So there is that kind of completely inextricable link between the two for me. And I had a big crush on Maggie Cheung when she was Jade in New Dragon Inn, so there was that.
Oh, she was great, wasn't she?
Yeah.
Yeah,
it looks like Hannibal Cook survived the narrative. I love that.
Was that her in the Bride of the White Hair? Oh wait.
No, that's Bridget Lynn, I think.
Oh, that's who I loved. Okay,
That's
sorry.
Bridget Lynn.
I get that was my crush. Yeah.
Oh God, yeah.
I'm okay with either. You know, they're both amazing.
Well, not that we're picking. I mean, we can't. That'd be horrible.
I think that they're quite different as actresses, but definitely very iconic, especially in the Wuxia of the 90s. In that kind of new wave era. So, can I ask what were the things you watched on the bootleg?
Okay, I'm going to be perfectly honest. I did not know the titles. I'm pretty sure we got a couple versions of Monkey. I have a feeling Bride with the White Hair was in there because when I saw Bridget Lynn again many years later, I was like, I know her, and I don't know her. I absolutely do not know her. But I know that there were like at least 2 or 3 versions of Legends of the Condor Heroes in there because, you know, if that one hasn't been shot 5 or 6 times. There was definitely that, but really the one that made the most impression was all the monkey stories, because suddenly there would be a man with monkey makeup or pig makeup on the screen. I'm like, I have no context for this, and I do not understand this because it is in Chinese.
I mean, there were like Iron Monkey 1, 2, and 3 or something like that. There were like 3 of them.
I remember him hatching out of the stone egg.
You know what? Maybe it's a different monkey story because you're talking about like the old Sumo Kong monkey stories, right? Because there was no egg in Iron Monkey.
Well, it's a very timeless story. I think every generation has made their own monkey and adaptations thereof. We have, for example, a lot of people remember Monkey Magic, and it's a great fun pop cultural kind of reinterpretation of the story. Some of the episodes have very little to do with the actual original work, and then you have some that are truer to the original. And so is Condor Heroes. We have an adaptation practically every generation or other generation. Mine was, I think the one I grew up with was Return of the Condor Heroes, the 90s version. And yeah, that was very memorable. And I definitely remember the pirate VCDs, which were the only way I got to watch Wuxia series in London back in the 90s and early 2000s. Okay, Wesley.
Yes.
What are your early experiences of Wuxia stories, and how did you relate to the genre first?
So I immigrated to the United States when I was 5 years old from Taiwan, and we actually moved to Nebraska, which is, you know, hotbed of Asian culture. So my father, my father had a scholarship at the University of Nebraska at the time. So there, back in the 80s in Nebraska, there were like literally 5 Asians in the entire state. And, like 3 of them were in my family. So it's kind of one of those things. So I don't really have a good reference toward also back in the 80s when you immigrate, there's a strong emphasis on like, hey, let's we are visitors here in this land. Let's really work hard to like integrate and kind of like not, and like just learn to be American. So I didn't really have a great connection to like my homeland. And the way I kind of got into it was watching like Wuxia movies. I think back then they had like something called Samurai Sunday, which is like really badly dubbed, movies that they would like they bring over, and they'd only play it on Sundays. And I used to watch those, and that's kind of like in a very jaded lens how I kind of like made the connection with the home country, I guess. So
which movies were they? Do you
like
remember?
36 Chambers of Shaolin, The Legend of the Drunken Monkey, the Drunken Master, every single Jet Li movie. I think Once Upon a Time. I've broken down every fight scene in Once Upon a Time in China too, because my specialty when I trained was the rope dart. And for the longest time, I was trying to make the rope dart work in the same way the bad guy, there's Donnie Yen, I believe, who was the bad guy in Once Upon a Time to China 2, where he fought with quote unquote a long piece of rope, which is really a rope dart / staff, but we're not and / chain whip. But I'm not gonna get into specifics for that. But so when I started training, it was kind of like, my like training wushu, like wusu, and like, watching those movies was like my connection to like, culture. And so I watched a very specific slice of movies that were all filmed between like the 60s and like 1995. And then I believe like, so I haven't seen anything more recent. There's a lot more CGI in the movies these days. To be honest, like there's a lot less emphasis on like the martial skill. And for me back then, that's what I really was glomming onto was, if you're gonna show me Mantis, I want to see some good Mantis. If you're gonna show me, Tongbei Chen, I want to see some good, white eight boxing. So I was watching those movies to really understand the flavor and the style. And I mean, like you said about like the Westerns, how your grandfather said, well, it's almost as good. And I completely agree with that analysis, because what your grandfather was really like, the story's the story, the setting's the setting. But what your grandfather really glommed onto was the flavor, the style, it just because wuxia stories have a lot of style, at least compared to like, what we see these days with, like your typical action movies, or even like your traditional European medieval stories. We're so used to seeing them played over and over again, that when we watch something like a wuxia movie, you're like, oh, this is something different. This is something that, you're not a chosen one. And it's not just like talking about, using martial arts for violence or for battle or the particular sense of honor or brotherhood, but it's also like, the concept of being the hero, being a superhero, where only you can save the world, is a very Western kind of viewpoint. While in a lot of wuxia stories, yeah, these are very special people, but the emphasis isn't so much in the me only I can save the world, is I do this for the greater good of the society. So that's kind of what I really like glommed onto when I was like growing up watching wuxia movies.
Wow, thank you. That's very interesting. That's kind of quite specifically quite unique to kind of Chinese or Asian kind of an approach to things, that it's not, just the single person saving the world, but acting for the greater good. And certainly when you have characters who are trying to forbid people from practicing the martial arts of a certain book because it's kind of too powerful, and people would just die and fight over it. That's kind of really acting in the interest of the community rather than kind of becoming the most powerful. And those movies you mentioned were just absolute classics, and very, very much during that time, the films before that relied a lot on special effects and kind of magic, sorcery, and things like that. And then there was a movement to like really bring in the actual kung fu, the to make everything look real on the screen. So in terms of kind of the specifics of the kung fu, they really kind of showed it in all its glory. Alice, could you tell us your early experiences of? We heard a little bit about that before, and can't wait to hear more about you and Jin Yong.
Well, I first read Jin Yong's novels when I was 10 or 11. And for me, reading his novels was a special treat for my school summer holidays. Other than reading those novels, I would spend time with my cousins during those holidays, and we would often play act heroes and heroines from his novels. I remember my favorite role was that of Xiao Longnu from The Return of the Condor Heroes. She's the kung fu master of the protagonist, and she's sort of involved with him in a tabooed romance, which is master-disciple romance. So, but I'm sure that I wasn't. I didn't know anything about their love relationship. I only loved the role because she's smart, she's beautiful, and she's very skilled in martial arts. Growing up, never stopped watching the endless screen adaptations of his novels. In recent years, I have been watching the China-produced web drama adaptations of Jin Yong's novels, as well as rereading some of my favorites, like Legend of the Condor Heroes, The Heaven Sword and Dragon Saber, The Book and the Sword, and Fox Folan from the Snowy Mountains. I can say that my addiction to wuxia stories has never waned. Lately, I have been hooked on the wildly popular Xianxia web drama series, The Untamed, which is adapted from Chinese writer Mo Xiang Tongxiu's web novel called Mo Dao Zu Shi. I have watched The Untamed 2 times, and I still want to watch it a 3rd time. And I'm really looking forward to the release of the web drama series adapted from another of her web novels called Heaven's Official Blessing. With the official English versions of hugely popular Xianxia novels written by Mo Xiang Tongxiu achieving New York Times bestseller status, and the warm reception of the official English translations of Jin Yong's Condor Heroes trilogy, I can see a trend of rising interest in the wuxia and xianxia genre in mainstream English publishing. And I recall seeing an announcement that the Tencent Group is about to release a whole new series of web drama productions adapted from Jin Yong's most popular novels. I can't wait for that. This is all very exciting and encouraging development for us diaspora writers in this genre, I think.
Definitely. Thank you, Alice. The rise of C-drama and the quality of the productions have had a phenomenal impact on the popularity of wuxia around the world. Tao, can you tell us about your early experiences of xianxia and wuxia? Have I asked you already? I can't remember. I haven't.
I have a very similar initial experience in some ways as Wesley. I grew up in Malaysia, so we didn't need to do bootleg stuff. We did actually get all of these big shows coming into the theater, and we would go as a family because my dad loved all of these movies as well, and we'd go as a family to go and see, Jet Li, in Once Upon a Time in China, or Fong Sayok, or well,
It's the
it's Tai Chi Master, but that was the translation when we were there. But I think they called Double Dragons or something over here. But you know, with Michelle Yeoh and things like that. But we also used to watch a lot of the older ones because they showed up in the TV for Jackie Chan, all of his older work as Drunken Master and all of those. Then Stephen Chow had his own very strange version of Wuxia, you know, Justice My Foot and Royal Tramp, you know, all of those were, I don't...
Really comedy.
They were a very comedy version
Parody.
of that stuff. At the same time, my brother started reading From Storm Riders, the
Riders.
comic,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that's more Xianxia than Wuxia. But he read that in Chinese and he'd bring it home and, you know, he'd be looking at it. I don't really read Chinese, but I love looking at the pictures and everything. And it was only later on that I picked up Jin Yong, other than, you know, catching the occasional movie adaptation of his works like Swordsman. I picked up The Return of the Condor Heroes, and that was the comic version of it that they did as it was translated, and I just utterly fell in love with that. And I was so happy that they did a reprint of that in a deluxe edition hardcover. So I bought that recently and had it shipped from Singapore at a really it costs a lot to ship that giant box, but I'm so happy to have it. And it's something I get my kid addicted to, and he's been reading the more recent translations of Jin Yong's Legend of the Condor Heroes, and he read all of the comics, you know. So for me, it's like Wesley, it was a connection to a kind of historical aspect of China that I didn't really see in Malaysia, because, you know, with diaspora, it's a very strange experience, and it's a strange experience seeing the work that's coming out from Hong Kong, or that came out of Hong Kong in the 1990s and 1960s to 1990s, and then the more recent work, as Alice said, from China, you know, and the way that the web novels are written and whatnot. But I think we've got a question about that, so I'll stop.
Yeah, we can talk a bit more about that later. So interesting influences, not at first from Jin Yong's novels and the Wuxia novels, but from kind of Xianxia and later kind of Wing Ma stories. And of course, it's interesting that development coming from Hong Kong at a later point, because of course Jin Yong himself was born in Zhejiang, but then he moved to Hong Kong, where he actually wrote all of his Wuxia novels. So it's interesting to see how those branches have how his work has influenced the branches that grew out of that. Last but not least, Amélie.
Yes.
Your experience is really different because you lived in Beijing, so I guess Wuxia was a lot more present. Wuxia and Xianxia are a lot more present in sort of every day. Would you say, or?
Yeah, I was listening to everyone's experiences, or most people's. I think we had like such the slightly kind of opposite, like we're meeting in the middle now, and I just love that, you know, it's such a diaspora thing. So for me, I grew up in Beijing, so I was pretty much entrenched in like the whole like wuxia and xinxia, like Chinese literature and everything. I remember like at my grandma's courtyard house, I would like take these like little sticks and fight my cousins and pretend we were reenacting the dramas and everything. And honestly, I will say now, I think I took some of that for granted. I remember my parents were like, "Oh, you should read." I actually don't know, 《水浒传》, Water Legend,
Margin.
one of the class, Water Margin. And I was like, no, I don't want to read it. So it was like it's a very opposite experience, because for me, I dedicated my like middle and high school to learning English and seeing, you know, what was happening in the West. So it didn't start to feel precious to me until I moved to the West. And so I remember like first coming here, like I went for college for a year. And when I got home, one of the old like Wuxia movies, I think it was like Legend of the Condor Heroes, was playing on TV, and I pointed at it, and I was like, "Oh my God, Chinese people on TV! I haven't seen that in a year." So it was kind of the opposite experience, where being here away from home has really taught me to treasure it and to cherish it and miss it. For me, I'd love to talk a little bit about like the Xianxia shows that have been gaining so much popularity lately, and Alice has touched on it, like The Untamed or Chen Qingling, rising from Mo Xiangtongxiu's books, which I love, and as well recent adaptations of like Xianxia romance, for which I'm very much the target audience, such as Ashes of Love and Love Between Fairy and Devil is the newest one. And I love how the genres or both sub or the subgenre kind of has evolved to just reach such a like almost like a global cult following where so many people love it. I don't know if it's the mainstream success of like Japanese anime or Korean dramas, for example, just yet, but I've met so many people who love it and just brings me joy. So definitely a lot of my works are inspired by just all of the literature, like Jin Yong, of course, but also drawing a lot of inspiration from the modern day trailblazers like Wong and the writers of those web novels that are bringing it nowadays to global platforms.
We're certainly seeing a whole new generation of writers, and the writers who would have read Gulong, Jin Yong, Liang Yusheng, etc., and they're very much kind of taking the genre, whether it's Wuxia or Xianxia or Xuanhuan, into new directions, both in terms of characterization and in terms of kind of the plot and the mingling of genres. This actually brings us nicely to one of the questions. I think I'm gonna open up the discussions, and you can or join in as in when you want to. Seems like people are quite comfortable with having a flowing discussion. So how does, excuse me, I have lost my thread a little bit. Right. So we touched up on this on several occasions. So how does the work of Jin Yong and his contemporaries compare with the recent explosions, which we're seeing a lot being acquired by Netflix and Amazon, and from the novels, adapted from the novels that are published online? Do you think the creative process is affected by the difference of the platform and even the content? So how do you think the kind of the classic or the new wuxia compared to the new wuxia, as they've been called?
I mean, just to start off, I mean, I think it's much broader now. I mean, right now, if I told, like, one of my favorite movies is Kung Fu Hustle, okay, Stephen Chow, and if I was to say it was wuxia, people, like, there would be 1,000 people would be like, that is not wuxia, because wuxia has this very strict definition of what, you know, what constitutes as that type of story, and technically they are correct, but in terms of like the martial arts, the flavor of what the story they're telling, the concept of honor and, you know, revenge and like, you know, redemption is very much a wuxia, like old school wuxia. And now with Xianxia, we have an explosion of basically like different types of storytelling that utilizes the same tools that wuxia has to tell a very almost a unique blend. You know, it's a modernized blend of that setting, but told in a different way, told in the Western way sometimes, or, you know, in mixing it with romance or the supernatural or all these things. So really, it feels like it's the genre, if you can call it that, has broken out of its initial like very kind of like tightly rigid boxes, and it's just like exploring different aspects of human experience.
I agree on that. I was also going to say that going back, I returned to reading a lot of Wuxia Xianxia stuff via web novels and Tencent's work and all those translations. And it's interesting to me because all of those are translations from people writing in China, and they're writing on as web novels. So they're getting paid by the word, and they have to pump out, hundreds of words and thousands of words, and it changes. I think the stories often get lengthy, and some of them just kind of end abruptly or just never get finished. The most successful ones like Untamed and stuff like that are amazing stories in themselves. I Shall Seal the Heavens, but there's also sections which almost feel like they drag on purpose, and there's a lot of repetition in that. Sometimes I feel so. I'm curious to see when they do translations over how they're fixing that, or if they're fixing that. But at the same time, it almost feels like some of the cultural biases that we saw in Jin Yon's work and whatnot about honor and duty and all of those things, they don't reflect as much inside the more modern Chinese web novels. They don't. Some of them, not Untamed. Obviously, you can see that very clear. But I'm thinking of other works that aren't. God of Slaughter is a great example. The stuff like that just kind of comes out where it's a lot more focused on face slapping and punishing the young masters and all of those things. And it feels like it's a different reflection on the reality of people within China. And I'm curious what Amélie or me or anyone else who's read that work think.
I absolutely agree and love what you both said. And Wesley, I was thinking about I love Kung Fu or Kung Fu Hustle, and I think a lot of the references in it are drawn from Jin Yong and Gu Long's work, because those writers have set such a bedrock foundation of cultural references and myths that are have been propagated throughout modern Chinese culture as well. So I would absolutely say Kung Fu is it feels like, and I don't know if Alice this is right, it feels like a very Hong Kong culture kind of take on a modern day Wuxia-esque, or incorporates elements of Wuxia into it. And I think that ties back to what Tao was saying about the shifting identities of these writers, whether it's diaspora or mainland or Taiwan, etc. But I think with some certain books like The Untamed, right? It takes the legacy of certain Wuxia and Xinxia cultural foundations and the tone, etc., and spins it into something that's very much adored and palatable to the modern audience. Sometimes maybe there's more detail, sometimes maybe there's less detail. Jin Yong's very specific in how he describes the action sequences, and sometimes I'll even skim them, right? But I think really this genre has evolved into so much more than just the traditional Jin Yong and Gulong, etc. But there's now Xuanhuan, and I'm not sure how to translate that, but very different interpretations and subgenres that have evolved according to what's popular with the audience and what's popular among writers. So it's so cool to have seen this foundation and then building upon it into modern times, especially given the whole geopolitical evolution of China and the culture and everything. So yeah, I love what you both said.
So I'm going to be super tacky about this, and getting back to what Tao was saying, there is this pleasure in being disposable and casual and so very available. I mean, we put up with it from David Copperfield and Dragon Ball Z, but there is, because the field is opening up so much, and because we are spoiled for choice right now in terms of, well, do I want to watch Untamed again, or am I going to watch The Legend of the Devil and the Fairy? Or, you know, that is so fantastic to have that choice. I don't have to be, you know, I'm like, well, I can watch my DVD of Legend of the Condor Heroes, or I can watch Bride with the White Hair, or I can watch this one thing that I found for like $1 that was about the vampire tree. You know, we have so many more choices than that. And that lets us get weird, and that lets us experiment. And suddenly we have a box to bounce around in. And, you know, people would say that having a box is a bad thing. And I don't necessarily agree with that. If we have a box, we can bounce stuff around, and we can riff, and we can play. And not everything needs to be as sacred as Condor Heroes was to me when I was a kid, like that, because that was it. And I don't think I would have ever dared to take that on, because it was so big and so important. And now I have like so much more content to rip off of and play with. My novella that actually probably does count as Wuxia is Into the Riverlands. And it would not have gotten the response it did. It probably wouldn't have sold to tour as it did if Untamed hadn't come out a few years ago. And that's something I'll always be grateful for, which is just the world opening up and the joy of disposable media, I guess.
I mean, if you really think about it, from a publishing standpoint, like the having more diverse settings other than like the U.S. or medieval Europe has only really happened in the past like decade or so. I originally wanted to write the first book, The Art of Prophecy, the first book of the War Saga, back in like 2015. But at the time, I was like, there weren't that many novels set in Asia. And, you know, it was a real risk to put that kind of time and effort into writing something like that when you're not sure if there's a market for it. I've had a friend who was subbing a Nation Epic Fantasy, and an editor actually told him, you know, it's a little bit cultural. and that's code. That's code for something. Okay, let's just be honest. That's code for something. Like, you know, that's code for this isn't medieval Europe, and I don't know if my readers will like it. So really, and I think maybe in the past like 6-7 years have we really seen a concerted push by editors to kind of find, you know, quote unquote own voices and different kind of stories, instead of what we see day in and day out. So I mean, in a way, it's almost like we're approaching a golden era of like different storytelling, you know, different kind of stories, different kind of settings, different kind of characters. So it's a good time.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, with people's increasing awareness of that the world is actually diverse, we're getting a lot more novels that are Asian-inspired fantasy, or fantasy from other parts of the world than the kind of Western-centric point of view and the Anglophone world. And I think then, I mean, Wuxia Asian-Inspired is then another degree of another level up from that. Once we have, you know, once this has become more of a norm to have a different kind of fantasy setting, the environment was more conducive to the reading of Wuxia and Xianxia. And it's definitely the time when the genre is really diverse, kind of diversifying. Writers are more, I can definitely see influences from the classic writers, but they're doing their own thing very much. Sometimes they would write a wuxia novel, and then they would branch off into creating this kind of fantasy world, more xianxia, like an entire world where they set a series of novels into, or maybe more qihua, which is more Western-inspired fantasy, or xuanhuan, which is Eastern and Western combined, more Eastern-inspired. So yeah, there is definitely something for everyone, and even kind of comical and slapstick series where you're in a kind of ancient setting and there is swordplay, but it's mainly kind of parodies or about something trivial. But then we also have kind of the more kind of things that are more within the Wuxia Xianxia tradition, new works in that genre, that are kind of actually dealing with all kinds of contemporary concerns to do with gender, to do with kind of society, war, for example, consequences of war, for example, that gets dealt with in things like The Untamed. So it's definitely a really good environment right now to write and write about Xianxia.
I don't know. I mean, to be honest, I don't think it's a very good environment for any kind of writing, no matter what genre it is right now. But that's a different story.
Anyhow, yes, that's true. So that brings us to the global development of the genre. What are the branches that we can see outside of China? Well, basically, it's you guys. Are there any distinct branches you can see, or is it kind of do you think it's mainly kind of inspired by the more classic works? Tao, I think you mentioned the Korean wuxia adjacent narratives.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of Korean narratives, Korean works that set in the ancient times, very similar to wuxia. I frankly speaking, if they didn't have a series of Korean names in there, you could call them wuxia, and no one would know. I've seen a bunch of those. I've also seen a lot of the romance, untamed gay love stories, or just plain romance. That's the boy love ones and the ones that appeal. Then there's the Xiuxian ones, which are the cultivation ones that are very popular, and that's the one that's the subgenre I write in, and that I know is very popular in the independent self-publishing world. One of the biggest books out there, written by a casual farmer, is oh god, now I can't remember what it's called. Beware of Chicken, which has been tearing up the Amazon charts, which is more, as you said, it's a funny little twist on the tropes where it's the hero just kind of runs away from being, trying to ascend to heaven, and goes to become a farmer because he doesn't want to deal with all of these people trying to kill him or face slap or stuff like that. And I'm seeing a lot of that, and I'm seeing a lot of, at least in the independent publishing side, non-diaspora, non-Chinese native people writing into wuxia and xianxia works. Will White, who writes Cradle, which is huge, has a xianxia adjacent work as well. So it's, from where I'm sitting, it's like a huge explosion. And of course, TradPub has been coming out with a ton of work too.
Yes, I think our TBR technical tech person mentioned that the Cradle series, that's what he really likes in terms of Asian fantasy. So that brings us, that kind of raises the question, is something that's written, it's Asian inspired, it's Wuxia Xianxia inspired, but written by a non kind of Asian person, could we call that Wuxia and Xianxia? I mean, I'm just playing the devil's advocate here. I mean, I've seen that raised recently. I'm inclined to say yes, because it's kind of a genre that it's not exclusively Asian in a way, but there are lots of, it's very stylistic. There are lots of tropes and lots of kind of set pieces that you can bring into other narratives. And after all, a lot of Hollywood cinema, for example, has definitely been influenced by the rhythm of the martial arts dramatizations in Wuxia films, and they have totally nothing to do with Wuxia. So,
I mean, I don't think anybody or any people can own a certain writing style or storytelling style. You know, I mean, I think one of the biggest influences that kind of helped usher, you know, kung fu movies and wuxia into the mainstream was The Matrix. You know, and like that definitely isn't a wuxia story, but it brought us it brought a lot of interest into that subgenre, because people are watching it for the first time and they're like, what is this? And this is amazing. And then once they learn about the backstory of the stunt choreography and how much, you know, and how they train for it, that they got into that kind of storytelling. So if somebody who's non-Asian wants to write something that's wuxia inspired, that's perfectly fine. I mean, I don't think there should be anybody who should say like, you are not allowed to write this because you know, you're a white person or something like that. That just, I mean, as long as you like are respectful towards how the content and how it's written and how the culture that influences that story, that should be perfectly fine, in my personal view.
Yeah, what I was thinking was the idea of genre, basically. I spent a lot of time over in the romance genre. And, you know, in the romance genre, we talk a lot about genre and, you know, what is the promise a genre makes you? If you read a book that is in the romance genre, we're promising you a happy ending. And, you know, as Alice said, Jin Young actually laid out for us, you know, what is a wuxia novel? What are our expectations going in as an audience? So, you know, you hit those expectations and sure, join the genre, but if you're not Asian, if you don't have any connection to it that I can see, maybe be ready for me to read that a little more cautiously.
Wait, is that really true? Do all romance books have happy endings? Like,
If you
are
are
there
writing,
like
if you're writing in the romance genre, if you are being published under a romance label, the guarantee is a happy ending. And I hate people who say that there's like no tension, you always have a happy ending. I'm like, you haven't read a lot of romance, because a good romance writer will make you fucking afraid for your life, even though you know that there's a good happy ending waiting for you. That's the guarantee.
so
okay?
good to have this
I did
insight.
not know that.
No, it's
I'm thinking of like
romance is
Bridgerton, right? And I don't have experience with the romance genre, but I think Bridgerton is romance, and I don't know that
Bridgerton is
season
old school
1.
romance. Like, and that's the thing. You will always get a happy ending out of it. That's the promise. That's the label.
Good to know.
Are there no unhappy ending romances?
Okay, say what? Okay, we're getting off topic, but on the other hand,
I'm definitely curious.
Bridgerton wuxia mashup would be fantastic. I would read the fuck out of that. No, there are romantic things. There, like Wuthering Heights is, you know, technically it's romantic. It's, you know, gothic, but it's not a genre romance.
I think taking it back to the topic
Yeah.
with regard to writing, right, and someone who's not, and I agree with Wesley completely, you know, there's no one that can say that you can't write in this genre, you know, but I will agree with Nghi that when I read something that isn't written by someone who has a connection to the culture, I do come in with a little bit of skepticism, just because, and it happens sometimes when I read it, and certain things just don't run right. There's certain Confucius principles, there's certain things that we do that, you know, just, and it can be as minor as, you know, Canadians take off their shoes when you walk into a house. Americans don't, you know. And it's minor things like that.
That's not minor, dude. That's not minor at all.
If you walk into my house
That's a
with
big
shoes
deal.
on,
Get out of my house.
Exactly.
I'll fight you.
martial arts.
Yeah.
I think that's where the cultural consultancy and sensitivity reading comes in. If somebody's outside of that culture, working with that culture, they need to kind of have these people have.
And it's just a case of it. For me, it's mostly it throws out the story, like reading something, and it's just these minor things that just don't work for me. And then I'm suddenly not reading a story where I'm immersed in it. I'm reading something that is off, you know. But I'm sure Wesley and I runs into the same problem when we're reading martial arts action scenes, and we're like, that doesn't work. I don't know why you have a 50-pound sword.
Don't even get me started for weapon weight. Oh my goodness, I'll go on forever about weapon weight.
I think
um,
I'll get you panel, Wesley, for TBR 2024 that you can suggest to Adrian about weapons and Wuxia, or real kung fu and Wuxia and Xianxia.
I think what Tao said was absolutely correct in terms of like there's a difference between somebody writing a scene set in, say, you know, Shanghai, versus somebody who's actually been there, who has heard the sounds, who can hear the, you know, the background noise, how the lights work in the middle of the night. It's, you know, there's it's the details that really matter, and those details matter very much so when it comes to martial arts, because everything is about details. It's about positioning. It's about range. It's about how you're angled. So when somebody's writing who doesn't know martial arts, or who doesn't know how, you know, how the flow of action works, you can kind of detect that if you're somebody who is familiar with it.
Yeah, so they really need to do their research and get the accuracy of and precision of these things.
But I've always thought that Jin Yong never in his life practiced any martial arts.
Yes, I read about that too, and I was amazed recently to find that he actually made up all of them. Every single, you know.
Yep.
That's why we call them fantastical martial arts, I think.
Yeah, I mean, he has people like drinking like wine, and then it comes out from their pores, and there's tea or something like that. And that's probably not what like Wesley and Tao can do.
Well,
I think
that's
definitely something to knowing how martial arts work, but also if on the other hand, another way to approach it is that if you don't know the rules, then you make up your own rules about.
Yeah. Also, in the Untamed, I've seen people using musical instruments as weapons, and I'm taking that idea for my novel too.
That's in my book, so that's definitely not possible.
Emily, I wanted to come to the two of you for the next question. So we have this diversification of the genre and something for everyone, but there are still new writers who are working on new Wuxia Xianxia works that are brilliantly kind of weaving in the historical elements into their novels, like the two of you. So I wanted to maybe start with Alice. How does history feature in your
Well, history is certainly an important part of Jin Yong's wuxia novels. He really had gone to great lengths in weaving true historical events and true historical characters into his stories. In fact, it was his novels that sparked my lifelong interest in Chinese history. In my own view, the blending of history and fantasy seems to work really well. Having previously published 2 historical novels, I have felt a bit hemmed in by the historical fiction genre's strict requirements for history, realism, and accurate research. Because this somewhat hinders the writers from flexing their imagination in the creative process. But on the other hand, from my own reading experience, a pure high fantasy story seems to lack substance and gives the impression of a mirage, making it hard for me to connect with the characters and hard to connect with the characters. So for me, blending history with fantasy would seem like the ideal solution, where the fantastical part allows readers to gallivant in make-believe worlds, and the history part lends the story plausibility that makes the characters and their motives more relatable. I think Wuxia fiction does exemplify this harmonious blending.
Thank you, Alice. I think Jin Yong does that very well, and it's kind of the historical setting the story of the Jianghu and all the entanglement against the historical backdrop definitely adds a very rich dimension to the story, and is something that you've continued to in the Heavenly Sword. Amélie, history also features very in a key way in your novel, and yet you've blended in kind of elements from lots of different historical periods, and also kind of the Chinese culture and language. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I love what Alice said, and I think we write and we create art as a kind of reflection or a mirror to some part of the world, whether it's external or internal. I think most of us, at least, and for me, that's definitely the case. Song of Silver, Flame Like Night is ostensibly set in a colonized kingdom that, it's very obviously an allusion to British colonized Hong Kong. I chose that setting because my husband's actually from Hong Kong. So Alice feeling very, kinship kind of there. And we talk so much about the effects of colonialism and imperialism, as well as identity, because interestingly enough, he says, well, I don't completely identify as like Chinese like you. I'm not British either. I am like a mix of the historical consequences of, the land that I was born onto. So the characters in my book are born into a conquered kingdom, and they ostensibly spend all of it, trying to fight these very blatantly Western colonizers. But they're also discovering a lot of secrets of the past that, there are certain traditions and cultures and clans that were, that vanished with time and that were sort of buried by the own regime changes and imperial history of their own kingdom. And so it's very much searching for their own identities and searching for, where do we stand? And if the enemy isn't only outside, sometimes it's the where we were born. It's not perfect, but we're going to fight for, a better future for everyone. And I think that's kind of a trademark of me. I'm in the young adult genre, and I think that's kind of a trademark, is that, YA literature often centers a lot on hope. Whereas I've read adult novels that everything just literally explodes and the world dies. Literally, I just read a novel, I think it was called by Ken Follett or something. But young adult novels, I try to gear mine towards, maybe the world is full of darkness, and, our histories, we have generational traumas carried from, our own family histories, but my characters are always going to be searching for the little fragments of light in that world.
That's really lovely. Searching for the fragments of light in the dark. So I think we already talked about this. it would be good to explore more the pop culture, the rise of Wuxia and Xianxia in pop culture, and what the impact this is having around the world. I mean, with Untamed, etc. Untamed was so influential, and then kind of for a mixture of reasons, but because it's brilliant and the brilliant adaptation, and because that it coincided with a pandemic, and it provided kind of entertainment and relief for a lot of people. And then we have kind of all kinds of fandoms springing up on all kinds of platforms, Tumblr, Archive of Our Own, fan fiction. So what do you see as the impact of Wuxia, Xianxia, the rise in pop culture of Wuxia and Xianxia? And I'd like to ask Amélie on this one again, because you were talking about how you really loved it, that all your friends were watching, or lots of people you'd spoken to were watching Xianxia stories or reading about Xianxia, and there's a real sense of community and like exchange there.
I think it's really cool that the genre has expanded outside of like the nexus of like Chinese and East Asian culture, and I think it's shifted, especially with diaspora writers like us, and incorporating different parts of our identities and experiences has really developed the genre. But I think that because it's growing so increasingly popular, from what I've seen at least, there's just a universal aspects to the themes of like courage and honor and maybe sometimes revenge that's explored in these stories, and I think that's what's propelling them to like the more and more so to the global stage.
Absolutely. I mean, they might be set in ancient China, but they deal with a lot of universal concerns. Can maybe anyone else? Nghi, would you like to?
Yeah. So I was on the bus a few months ago, and I was kind of dozing off because it was way too early in the day for me to be doing anything. But there's this teenager and her mom sitting close to me, and they're talking in Spanish, and you get the idea very clearly that this is a very passionate teenager who's going on about something that her mother has heard about quite a bit at this point, and I'm just tuning them out, trying to sleep, a good idea or bad idea. But suddenly I hear her say Wei Wuxian, like in the middle of, and I'm like, what? And I look over and I realize this teenager is dressed entirely in black and red, and from her backpack she's got a little Wei Wuxian themed bunny keychain hanging off the back, and I'm like, cool. And I mean, I don't know what that says. I just think it's a really cool, good thing. And I briefly thought I had dreamed it because I kind of fell asleep a little bit on the bus later, but it was just fantastic.
It really seems to kind of transcend all kinds of ranges and boundaries, whether it's age, background, or orientation. It just seems so universal.
Yeah, it wasn't quite making the generation gap jump just yet, but I mean, give that girl time. She was gonna do it.
Oh, well, I met kind of some older people, some older fans of the genre, definitely.
I actually enjoyed seeing the number, especially on TikTok and stuff like that, the amount of people wearing hanfu and making it a trend again, and that's, I think, really kind of cool because it's such a, in some ways, impractical set of clothing, but it looks so good, and I can't wait to see more of that clothing start showing up at comic cons and other fan conventions. And I think once that happens, that'll be a huge impact too.
Yeah.
Yes, the cosplay involvement. A lot of there are lots of crossovers between the kind of Xianxia fandom and the anime, etc. fandom, and so it's nice to see cosplays in Hanfu as well as like from anime, and definitely it seems to have it seems to go hand in hand with the Hanfu revival and revival of kind of the interest in classical and traditional culture in China, but as well as around the world, kind of into the heritage of where the genre has come from. And I think one example of this global impact of pop culture is I'm actually doing an MA at the moment in Chinese studies, and one of my classmates has actually, decided that she wanted to learn Chinese because she loved C-drama, and that's like an amazing kind of she loves C-drama so much that she wanted to learn Chinese, and now she's doing an MA. It's kind of really positive impact of Wuxia and Xianxia, of the spread of this global culture. So in the last 5 minutes or so, I'd like to finish with what's next for you, and can you all tell us a bit about your upcoming projects and what we can look forward to from you? We'll start with Wesley.
Okay.
What's
so
up,
since I was absolutely unprepared, like everybody, I actually brought my book this time. So this is The Art of Prophecy. This came out in August of this year. It's a beautiful artwork by Tran Nguyen, who is an amazing artist. I'm currently working on the sequel, The Art of Destiny, which is supposed to come out later this year. The date might slip depending. Right now, I'm doing some rewrites and edits, and depending on how that goes, we'll see what happens with that. But that is what I'm working on right now, and this is going to be a 3-book series, so I will be waiting in this world for at least 3 more years, I'd say. These are all big books. The first book is 180,000 words. The second book is like pushing like 2 ton right now. So if any of you have writer friends, I highly recommend you tell them not to write big books, because it gets exponentially more difficult the bigger they get.
But we all love a trilogy these days.
Yeah, I know.
So,
Wesley, sorry, I read The Art of Prophecy, and I enjoyed it very much.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thank you.
So Alice, what's next for you? I know the Heavenly Sword has just published.
Yeah, The Heavenly Sword was released on January 10th, to be exact. I'm still hard at work with book 2 of my Sword Maiden from the Moon duology. As for future project, I have in mind an idea for Wuxia myth novella, which will probably be a spin-off from Jin Yong's novel Demigods and Semi-Devils.
Oh,
That's
wow.
just an idea. I haven't got anything concrete yet.
Thank you. How can we look forward to the next next volume in the 1,000 Li series? Or
Yep.
Yeah.
And that is actually coming out on February 1st on in Amazon and audiobook. So that's very soon. It will be publicly released or widely released for people to read. And that's going to be my next big thing. And I'm working on book 9 right now, which is, like Wesley says,
Wow.
it's a scramble.
Long series. Yeah, I'm reading it. I'm really enjoying it. It feels a bit like the Poppy Wars, but for like an older generation.
Thank you. That's quite a compliment.
Going to the academy and then training and then choosing one's kind of cultivation texts and things like that. Nghi, what can we look forward to from you? I know that you've also just published the third volume of the trilogy of I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name has escaped me.
Couple months ago, we got the a while back ago, we got the third book in the Singing Hills novella series. Yes, that's it. I forget too sometimes. We got that book. The third one came out a couple months ago. The next one is coming out in September, which is called Mammoths at the Gates. The cover just dropped yesterday or today or yesterday. I didn't sleep much, so I'm super excited by that. There is a fifth Singing Hills book coming out next year that currently doesn't have a decided name. I'm just gonna let other people fight about that. I can't do titles. And currently I'm working on this thing with 1930s bank robbers in the North Woods, which is super cool. I'm really enjoying the research for that one. And yeah, I don't want to write long novels. So I'm like, can I just write novellas forever? It's like I'm done in 20,000 words. It's fantastic.
But I mean, I having read the first volume, it feels like every word it counts. Not that every word in the other novels don't count, but it feels like every word is like crucial to the I mean, I can't wait to get back into the world, into that unique world again.
Oh, thank you.
I have more time, and all my deadlines are finished. So Amélie, what can we? I know that your novel was just published in the US and it's about to come out in the UK in March.
In February, one day after Taos.
In February. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm so looking forward to it. Can't wait to read it. So it's a duology, is it? So is that the first volume that's come out and you're working on the second one, or you've written the second one already and you're working on something else?
Yeah, so I am very much like Wesley and Tao and everybody in I call it Deadline Jail, Deadline Cave, with book 2 for the Song of the Last Kingdom duology. So really, really rushing that. It's always really hard, I feel, the second book, because you're kind of promoting the first book, and it's a very different mindset between that and writing. But on a very tight deadline for that, and then I'm about 2 months late in turning in my next submission to my agent. But I would love to do more Xianxia-inspired fantasy. And maybe this time a little less action and honestly more chill, maybe romance and fairy vibes. I think most of my books have been really like action packed, so I'm just like, whew, like maybe I just need to like vibe a little bit more. But yeah, so that is what I'm working on right now.
That sounds amazing. Can't wait to hear more about that. So I'd like to thank you all very much for joining us on this panel. It's been absolutely fascinating, and I can literally go on for a few more hours discussing these fascinating topics with you. And I hope we get to do more panels on Wuxia Xianxia and related genres in the future.
Thank you so much. It was so
Thanks
great
for
to
having
chat
us.
with everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.